Hello, cult hackers, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Celine, a media graduate with an interest in cults.
And I'm Stephen. I'm Celine's dad. I'm an organisational psychologist. I was raised in a cult. I left when I was about 30. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. Right. So we're very excited today. We've got a very special guest. We've got a fellow podcaster and somebody that we've known for quite a while now. So Kacey from the Cult Vault, welcome to the show.
Hi, Stephen. Hi, Celine. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a good way to spend a Sunday morning in the same time zone.
That's right. It's so much easier. It's funny. I did a quiz the other day, and one of the questions was, "What are the 4 different time zones in the United States?" I thought, 3 years ago, I would have had no idea about the answer to that question, but now, just reeled them off really quickly because you get to know, don't you?
You do. I didn't know much about major religions or the Bible, and now I feel like when people mispronounce Job as Job, I can correct them.
Or Titus instead of Titus. That's always an amusing one. Yeah. Well, we want to talk to you about all the stuff that you've learned, because I think your kind of journey is going to be really interesting to someone like me, particularly, I suppose, and our listeners. So we'll get into that. But you've hit a bit of a milestone over the last couple of days. So as we were recording this is Sunday the 23rd. I'm not sure when we'll get to play this actual episode. But what is the news at the Cult Vault Hub?
Well, oh goodness, 3 years and 260 something episodes later, we've finally reached the 1 million download milestone. And I feel like I've been watching that number slowly tick up for the last sort of 100,000 downloads. But yesterday I got a nice little notification that's finally happened. So now I can focus on the next 5 million downloads.
So that's a fantastic achievement. Congratulations on that milestone. That's absolutely brilliant. And it's been great to see your podcast develop and become what it is today. We wanted to get a bit of your story, really. How did you end up doing the podcast and why? Let's start with those 2 questions, really.
That's one of the questions that I get asked the most, and it's by this point, to anybody that's heard it before, probably a really boring story, and it's almost scripted at this point. But it was April 2020. We had a 4-month-old newborn as brand new parents, and we had all, as a nation and most parts of the world at this point, just gone into a lockdown for a global pandemic, which is something that none of us have ever lived through before, unless you do believe in immortality and vampires, which I do not. So I'm assuming that this was the first pandemic that we'd all lived through simultaneously. And it was a really tough one, because when you become a parent, people have these really interesting bits of wisdom that they throw at you, like, oh, get sleep while you can when you're pregnant, which is actually quite difficult because it's not the most comfortable thing. And when you become a parent, I feel like nobody really prepares you for, or can prepare you for, this shift in identity that happens instantly. You go from being an independent person to being a parent, and that is such a strange thing to balance in your mind. I was really struggling with being at home, isolated from everybody. My parents live a few hundred miles away, so I'd phone my mum and she'd give me advice, but she didn't have a baby during lockdown, so it's a whole different experience. And I was binge watching so many box sets on TV. My partner was working night shifts, and our baby was kind of going through those phases of waking up every sort of 45 minutes. So there really wasn't any point in me trying to get sleep, because being on the brink of sleep and then being pulled out of it, as many of the listeners who have experienced sleep deprivation will understand, is trauma. It's traumatizing. So it was actually better to wait until my partner was home to just get sleep than it was to try and sleep. And I would binge watch all these box sets, and I was seeing all my friends on social media like, I'm going to learn how to do the splits during lockdown. I'm going to learn how to make my back garden the most beautiful green thumb garden in the whole street. And I was like, what am I going to do during maternity leave and during lockdown that is separate from motherhood? I really, really, really loved those early days, those cuddles, those snuggles. Breastfeeding was so special, but there was still something that I needed that was separate to that. And I tried all sorts of different things that didn't work out well. Knitting, I couldn't get into. Baking, I was hideous at baking. And I found a box in our spare room that had a room mic in and loads of notes that I'd made on unsolved mysteries that I found really interesting. And I was like, oh, I had that funny idea to start a podcast. And then I told my friend on the phone later that day, and she said, oh, you should start a podcast about cults. I've just finished reading a memoir by Jenna Miscavige Hill about her uncle being the leader of Scientology and her escape in Scientology. And I think that subject is fascinating. And I was like, well, I don't really know much about cults. I know a few things from what I've seen in documentaries, so I'll give that a go. And it was really, really, really tough recording that first episode, as I'm sure you could both remember from recording the earlier stuff. It's like I sat in the bedroom with this room mic and Audacity kept crashing. I'd be reading a script and it would cut off halfway through. And then I'd go back to Audacity and it would have stopped recording, and I didn't know where I was up to when it stopped. And I could hear baby crying downstairs with my partner like, oh, it's okay. Because that's where breastfeeding can be a bit tricky. So it was just stressful. But I got the first few episodes out, and then I got contacted by Helen Zuman, who has written a memoir named Mating in Captivity about her time on Zendik Farm. And she was like, do you want to read my book? And I said, absolutely. I read the book. It was incredible. And then I asked Helen if I could interview her, and she said yes. And I'd never done anything like that before. I've worked with a lot of people in various roles that require being person-centered and communicating in certain ways, but never in this kind of journalistic format, especially with so little knowledge about the subject of cults. And I was dripping. I had sweat dripping down my back. I was just mumbling so much and stuttering. Someone actually commented on one of my earlier episodes saying, do you have a stutter? And I released the episode with Helen. It was a great success. And after that, people just kept emailing in saying, can we share our story with you? And here we are today.
Wow. That's really interesting. I didn't know all of that. That's fascinating stuff.
At that point, were you, because I know you said you were kind of interested in the crime stuff as well. When you started, were you thinking, oh, you would do a bit of crime, a bit of cults because they're kind of linked, or were you just like 100% in the cult stuff from that point, I guess?
I was going down the road of having a mixed bag of content. There were a few things I'd read about survivors of Jonestown that were found murdered a couple of years after the Jonestown massacre took place, and I thought that was really interesting. And I think that kind of bridged the cults and unsolved mystery stuff together for me. So I did a few really kind of top of the pyramid stuff on conspiracy theories. No deep dives, just overview episodes on conspiracy theories. But my perspective on true crime changed so much after I started doing this podcast. I would fall asleep watching Forensic Files. I would watch TV series and be really kind of just disconnected from the people whose stories were being told. And as soon as I interviewed Helen, I said to her something about the sex cult. And she shut me down straight away. And the sex cult stuff was something that I'd read doing research about Zendik in a news article on something like the Daily Mail, who love to use this type of kind of salacious language. And she said it wasn't a sex cult. It was a community that had a radical take on sex and relationships. And in that moment, it was like my first epiphany of, oh my goodness, there is so much to learn about this subject that I have no idea about. And I'm going off of sensationalized journalistic pieces that are clickbaity, that are titled in a way that makes you think, oh my goodness, that can't be true. You know, like those weird magazines that have like lover keeps deceased husband's head in freezer for 3 years, or something wild that you see on these like magazines. And I just started thinking, yeah, I'm not comfortable with it. And then I started to question my relationship with true crime and realized that it was just so unethical and so much of what is wrong with the genre of true crime and the true crime community. And I am part of a few subreddits for other podcasts, true crime podcasts that are quite prominent in the world. And people would go to these message boards and they would say things like, oh, this week the podcast put their guest speaker's face as the Instagram post instead of the murder victim that they were talking about in the case. So they made it more about this collaboration with a celebrity than they did about the actual person's story. And it was through reading things on that message board and reflecting on my connections that I was making with cult survivors that I realized I did not want to be on that side of the fence anymore. And I really had to question what kind of platform I wanted to create with the Cult Vault podcast, which direction I wanted to take it in, and what messages I want to give listeners who are like myself, coming from a place of not having cultic experience, but wanting to be educated and understand it more. And I also didn't want to have that kind of like got you journalistic approach where you lead somebody into a line of questioning because you think you can ask them questions that again might not be completely ethical just for the sensationalism or trauma porn, as I heard Elgin Strait say at one time. So that's really kind of the journey that I've been on with my relationship to true crime. And since I've had kids specifically, I can't watch things like I used to. I can't watch things about children. I can't, and in my downtime, when I'm not doing cult related stuff and taking a break from some of the really dark subject material that we focus on with these conversations, I don't want to be immersed in true crime. I want to watch the Barbie movie. I want to watch really mindless comedies where you can go out of the room, get a bag of popcorn, sit back down on the sofa, and you just haven't missed anything important. So it's I don't really know how to answer that question, Celine. But there's my long-winded answer for you.
I think you did a pretty good job.
That's good.
Brilliant.
Yeah. I was going to say, so just off the back of that, how much of your listener, it's probably hard to know, but from your like point of view, I guess, how much of your listeners are sort of, I guess, ex high control members, and how much are, I guess, like general public that's not been a member of those groups before?
It's an interesting question. I think from the communication that I've had with different listeners, it's a mixed bag. Some people are survivors of certain groups and they'll drop in just for episodes specifically related to that group. The troubled teen industry stuff that I've covered on the podcast is an example of that, of that kind of sub genre within the cult umbrella. I get people tuning in that leave feedback saying, can you do deep dives into more infamous stuff? Can you do less interview based stuff? And I think that feels more in line with people that haven't been in cults or experienced coercive control, who are looking for that kind of long episode approach with a narration of an infamous cult, which is just what I do on my Patreon. So I do enjoy doing the research and deep dive stuff. And after I decided to move into doing primarily interview based stuff on the podcast, the way I could keep the research stuff and have somewhere for it to go was Patreon, which also, of course, goes towards supporting the podcast. So that's kind of a win-win with that stuff. And I'd say that my regular listeners that reach out to me and come to chat with me or support the show are also a mixed bag of survivors and people that just found the show and enjoyed the show. I do have one listener who is just inspiring to me. His name is Pastor David, and he listens to the Cult Vault podcast before every congregation that he leads, every time that he gets up to preach for his congregation, and he says that it stops him from falling into anything that might be spiritually abusive.
Wow.
And I think that's incredible. He messaged me the other day to say that he had been approached by a couple of men who claimed to be from something like the Church of True Light and Love, or a mixture of those kinds of terms, and they were trying to put together a type of ministry. So go into all the churches in the local area and asking them to just sign a piece of paper that says that they are part of this ministry. So not signing over any rights of church or practice, but just to say on paper that his church was part of this community of churches. And through asking a few more questions, David came to realize that these two people were from Shincheonji, and they were withholding certain bits of information from him and trying to get churches in the local area to sign onto the Shincheonji ministry. And he said that he only recognized through the terminology that they were using and the types of tactics that he's heard about on the Shincheonji interviews on the Cult Vault podcast, that's who it was. And he asked them, and they said that is where they are from. So I just thought that was incredible.
It's great when you see results like that, when people reach out and they tell you for some reason that it's helped them in one way or another. It's really great, isn't it, when you get those messages. So what would you say were some of the things that you got wrong about cults then? So you said you sort of had to learn from scratch. So tell us, I don't know, 3 years ago, Kacey, compared to today, Kacey, how would you have described cults and what would you have thought about them?
Oh gosh. I heard Alexandra Stain say once that people think cults are these exotic things that only happen in countries far away from them. I also thought that. I think I also thought that I would never join a cult, and that anybody that joins one, it must be stupid. Anyone that joins a cult must not have good willpower or critical thinking skills. Just the general misconceptions that still exist that I come across every day. And why don't you just leave? Oh gosh. And in some ways, I am really grateful to have come from that perspective, because it's easier to have conversations with people who have those misconceptions. Of course, I didn't even think that people could be born and raised in cults. That's not even something that had ever crossed my mind.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Cults are just things that people join in the 60s and 70s, and then loads of people die. In my really naive mindset of sort of 4 years ago. And even now, some of the stuff that is coming out, like the recent Netflix documentary on the Waco siege, oh gosh, just the most infuriating thing I've watched in a long time. It fuels that misconception. And what's kind of cool now is being able to look objectively at a media piece like the Waco documentary and talk about what's missing, what should have been included, that I just would not have been able to do 4 years ago. I would have just watched it and been like, why didn't those people just leave? And it doesn't answer those questions. It doesn't tell you why. And that's what we need in the world. We need these pieces to be offering us both the stuff that makes people want to watch it. And then once people want to watch it, we can get the education stuff in, because the audience is already there.
Yeah, that's really true. And I think, podcasts like yours is the way that we increase that knowledge and that sort of baseline, a bit of education. So yeah, there is a kind of balance. It's got to be interesting for people to want to tune in, to want to listen to it. It can't all be sort of deep academic stuff, and that's why stories are so important, because we are attracted to people's stories. But it also needs to smuggle in some of the actual facts about it as well, I think. I was going to ask you about your so obviously you've done quite a bit of research. You're going to do some more, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But what's your... So there's a lot of expertise, or people who sell books, and other podcasters, and people who describe themselves as cult experts, and so on. What's your kind of take on this, the state of play, if you like, at the moment in understanding cults, and how much we know, how much we don't know, and where we need to go next?
Oh, it's tricky. It's tricky because I feel... And this is really prominent for me when I go to things like the International Cultic Studies Association conferences. There really isn't a bridge between people wanting to learn about cults and not really knowing much about them or where to go, other than, Netflix documentaries that don't really do much to help that, and people that have experienced cults and are in recovery or are educating others. There's no gap in the middle. So I often find that it's difficult to find the right place for myself when I attend those conferences. I don't want to come across as somebody who is there to exploit people's experiences and gather people's stories. But I also want people to be aware that I'm not presenting myself as somebody that is a cult survivor. I am very open about being a podcaster, knowing that that is something that might put people off, especially if individuals have had negative experiences with newspapers, press, journalists that have come to ask people to share their stories before people have had a chance to really think about the ramifications of telling your story, whether to use your full information and allow that to be on public record. So it's really interesting in those types of environments to find the right place. But then again, do you need to fit in? Do you need to feel like, do you need to, you would know this better than anyone, Stephen, about kind of group psychology and wanting to be, part of the group. But maybe it's not a bad thing that it's not always comfortable. But this work allows me to interact with some of the most incredible minds, I think, in the world. The most recent ICSA conference was just full of so much different material that went in so many different directions. And some of the talks directly contradicted one another. And that is just fascinating to me. But it's backed up with research, and people are coming out with their own frameworks and methodologies for things. And it's really, really exciting for somebody like myself to be able to attend these conferences, talk to survivors, and be a part of a community that has high walls around itself for good reason. We just have to make sure that the gatekeeping in certain areas doesn't damage the work that is trying to happen. Because sometimes you can try and cover a group and you get shut down by survivors who don't want any part of that, which I understand completely, and always respect those boundaries.
Yeah, I think that's very, very interesting comment, really. I mean, I can only speak for myself, really, but I think as somebody who was raised in a group, I don't know, I always feel a fraud calling myself a survivor, but okay, I was in a group, I was in a cult for 30 years, grew up in it and left. As somebody that is, I consider myself a researcher, and obviously I've I've had education in scientific methodology and so on. So I think those two things put together, I really feel that it's important to have people like you who haven't experienced life in a cult. It's important to hear those voices too. That might seem, I know not everybody agrees with that, but I think there is a real risk that if we only allow people that have actually experienced things to talk about this topic, then we are losing something. We're losing another perspective that we desperately need. Plus, I think one of the things that I want to see with cult research is a bit more of a rounded out field where, yeah, I'm a big believer in people's stories and listening. We have interviews on our podcast, and also qualitative research is really important. But I think we also need some more kind of scientific approaches to some of these psychological questions that currently we don't have the depth. There is some of that, but there isn't enough depth of that. It's really dominated by the fields of psychoanalytic practitioners, of counselors, and so on. And they're really, really important because obviously they pick up the pieces for us as someone who's benefited and still benefits from that sort of support. I really support that. But we also need to understand a bit more of the real psychology of what's actually going on in the mind, and how these groups operate, the processes they use, the methods they use, and so on. So people like you who can look at it from the outside, I think is really, really important. So yeah, I would completely support that.
Also thinking about how we educate the wider world. If we're placed into silos in some ways, I know that even some people have expressed kind of being wary of the terminology of first generation, multi-generation survivors, MGAs and FGAs, because there's a fear of being placed into those silos or boxes again, and having people label you in a way that you might not want to be labeled. It does make it easier when communicating with people to say, this is I am, because it gives a lot of context to a person's experience. But in order to bridge that gap between the wider world and those that have experienced life in a cult, or people that are educating themselves and others who are working in the field of cult education and cult awareness, we can't bridge that gap if the entire demographic of people in that field is made up of the same demographic. So
absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I liken it to so eating ice cream. Let's say if you've never eaten ice cream, you can't really understand what the sensation of eating ice cream is like. You can't know the qualitative experience of eating ice cream, and that is absolutely true. In order to know what eating ice cream is really like from a sort of qualitative perspective, you have to have eaten it yourself. However, that's not the only thing you can say about it. So you can analyze what ice cream is made up of. What are the ingredients of ice cream? How does it get made? What are the differences between good and bad ice cream in terms of what people say? What are people's stories about the first time they ate ice cream and the different experiences they have? So yes, it's true that there is a unique perspective that individuals have when they've experienced life in a cult. But that doesn't mean the conversation stops there and there's nothing anybody else can say about it. So we definitely need all of those aspects as well.
The language is important because, like you say, it helps and it's quick for understanding. And like you say, you didn't necessarily know that, some years ago that born-ins was a thing. So obviously having that language makes it a lot easier to have those conversations, because it's it's quite descriptive, it's quite clear, you can understand and start a conversation from there. It's just the concern of just doing exactly what was happening if you were in the groups anyway, of separating and
absolutely and you're also at risk of pushing out other people who might want to learn but don't understand that terminology and would have to do quite a bit of legwork to get to a place where they recognized certain terminologies. You know, I see, you know, terms like DARVO being thrown around a lot at the moment, and it's a really helpful acronym, but you would have to actively go out to understand what the words were in that acronym. And especially then how that applies to these specific situations, because DARVO can be used to look at narcissism and narcissistic abuse. It can be used to look at, you know, intimate relationships and domestic violence and domestic abuse. So it's you are right, Celine. It's easy to have these acronyms and to have these descriptive terms, but again, could be a way that people find this field inaccessible. So like you said, Stephen, I think the best way to go is to make sure that everybody is being safe, everybody is being sensitive, everybody is listening to each other and actively trying to educate and learn, but everybody should also be able to do that.
And I looked down and I see she had a knife right at my back. And of course, now I'm banging on the door, and the RA comes running from the computer in the hallway and opens the door. And I sprinted 3 stairs at a time up to my room.
Yeah, the culture at Bob Jones University is very much like other religious institutions. They created a shame structure. These structures are intended to keep people within the boundaries of what the group or the cult wants them to be in.
I was followed a lot my freshman year, second semester, because I got what was called socialed. The RA, the resident assistant on my hall, would follow me around from classes.
Being able to say that's Satan, being able to say something's controlling you in a negative way so that you have to then dismiss those drives and you have to dismiss your anger and the resentment, etc., is it's like tying someone's hand behind their back, because you're not teaching people how to address it.
Surviving Bob Jones University of Christian Cults is a thought-provoking podcast series that delves deeply into the history of Bob Jones University, the psychology of fundamentalism, the criteria for cults, and survivors' experiences. The series is premiering August 23rd, 2023. Please spread the word and leave a positive review to help other listeners like you find the show.
If you're enjoying the podcast, you can support it by becoming a patron. You can support the podcast for just £1 or $1.50 and receive a variety of Patreon benefits as a thank you. Don't forget to share the podcast, follow, like, subscribe, and rate the podcast on the podcast app you're using. A review is particularly helpful as it gets us recognised by new listeners. And finally, if you'd like to reach out to us and tell us about some cult hacking you've been involved in, or you just want to say hi, you can do so by going to culthackers.com and using the contact form. We love hearing from our cult hackers. Thank you for listening, and now back to the podcast.
Let's get on to the masters. So I don't know if everybody knows this, but you are embarking upon a masters. Tell us a bit about the studies you're going to be doing.
Oh gosh, I've been out of school now for about 12 years, so I'm a bit nervous to be going back to school, big school as I would call it. It's the Salford University postgraduate course in the psychology of coercive control. It's the only course I've been able to find of its kind in the world that is not too far from where I live, but also completely remote. So having 2 young children makes it an ideal course. I'm hoping to have the knowledge and education that I have gained through this podcast experience, through all of the survivors and every single person that's ever taken the time to speak to me, to have it accredited in some way, so that I can go on a journey of becoming a cult expert. I'm 30 years old, The leading experts in the field right now are either supposed to be retired but still working very hard, or are looking at retiring in the next few years. And I speak to individuals like John Atack, and they say that there's grave concern about where the field will go if the next generation of experts are not wanting to move into the space, are moving in other directions. So I'm hoping that I can contribute to the field somehow. I don't find myself drawn towards becoming a therapist or a counsellor. I don't really know where I plan to go with the master's course. I just know that I have so much knowledge of this field now that it makes sense to have a certificate to say that.
and there'll be lots of stuff that you like, like always, that you didn't know. So
absolutely,
I'm sure
yes,
there'll be lots of great stuff. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting course. When I chose my master's in organizational psychology, I'd already chosen that, and I was deep into that. And then I noticed this course. It was quite new, so I think it had only really just started to being advertised. And at the time, I thought, oh no, I should have, I wish I'd have done that one, because that was really, an area of intense interest. But I got a lot of benefit out of the one I did. But yeah, it looks absolutely fascinating. I know there's lots of other people that have been on that program. I know Chris Shelton completed that program, who obviously I think listeners will know he has his own podcast, ex-Scientologist. And it's great that this little group in Salford are really producing all of these people that have a really deep knowledge of coercive control in various different settings. So what's the bit that you're really looking forward to? I know it's remote, but what are you looking forward to?
It's going to sound strange, and I know I'm going to hate it when it happens, but I'm looking forward to having to sit down and write a paper about something specific that really interests me.
Yeah.
I know I'll probably struggle with deadlines, but I have been working my way through the reading list, and I'm looking forward to seeing how I can apply all of the things that I've been reading about and all of the things that I've learned through the podcast. There's 2 papers due between September and Christmas, so I think it's going to be stressful and it's going to be a struggle, but I'm looking forward to that. And I'm also looking forward to understanding how coercive control applies beyond cults. I have done episodes on the Cult Vault podcast about the armed forces. I've talked about gang recruitment and grooming of children into gangs. I've talked a lot about human trafficking for various purposes. So I feel as though I was connecting the dots of coercive control beyond cults before I found out about this course. So to be able to go on this course now and understand that in depth is really exciting for me. Something that I find absolutely fascinating about every interview that I do is my brain's ability to connect certain practices from one group to another, or say, oh, that sounds like that comes straight out of the Scientology playbook, and here's an example of this from an interview that I did with this person. So that's something that I find interesting, but also just being able to support survivors more in an informed and educated way is my main motivation. I think we can never do enough to understand how best to approach people and how best to try to understand people's situations and experiences without ever having lived them yourself. So that's kind of where I'm heading with everything. Where I'll be in 5 years' time, I have no idea.
Yeah, well, that's a great thing. It gives you options, doesn't it? And that's what you'll have at the end of it. I think that's fantastic. I'm really I'm kind of a little bit jealous, but just really pleased for you that you're able
There's
to.
Still spaces. Come and join us. Come and join us.
I can't afford it. I've shot my bolt because you can only get one set of loans for a master's, so I'd have to pay for the whole lot. So yeah, I did think about doing, because you can do some modules as kind of postgraduate certificates. So I did look at doing that. I have thought about doing that, but yeah, you can't do everything. You can't do everything, Kacey.
Well, this is my plan. I'm
Yeah.
going to see if anyone on the course wants to start a little Facebook group or something. And then we get a shared Google folder and we all put in our notes from our classes. And I'm hoping to create this little network of like thoughts that people had about certain materials and that sort of stuff. So hopefully we'll have a little not to sound too culty, but we'll have a little hub of people that share information about what they're learning and things like that. So it's exciting.
I think you'll love it. You'll find it really interesting. I'm sure you will. So what's your thoughts around getting back to the sort of bigger subject of cults and how we I suppose manage them or what we do about them in society? So it's an area we're sort of starting to get into in discussions a bit more as a modern society, with balances between freedom of speech and worship and all of that, and some of these practices. What's your thoughts after so many interviews and discussions with people about how we move forward with that topic?
I asked Alexandra Stain this question, and she was talking to me about the work of the Family Survival Trust, a UK-based charity that you're raising money for right now.
That's right. Yeah.
People can go and donate.
Oh, please do. Yes, please do.
And Alex said on an interview with me that the best thing we can do now to further the understanding of coercive control and the laws that currently exist in the UK around coercive control through the Crown Prosecution Service is to start a conversation with people that can change those laws, people that can get the ball rolling in changing those laws and widening them so that they don't just apply to family environments and intimate relationships, but they also extend to groups. I've spoken to Carol Murchison about this and how likely it is that we will ever be able to strip certain religious groups of their privileges when they are known to be abusive. And she talked me through the difficulties because government in certain capacities then has to admit that there is a flaw in the system. It's probably easier for government to allow religions to exist in the way that they do, especially over in the States with religious freedom, than it is to say, okay, we've allowed this group to become an organized criminal a criminal group that is profiting off of human trafficking and is basically the church as a front group for all of this underground criminal activity that's taking place. So I don't know what luck we'll have in kind of stopping abusive religious practices as a whole, but groups that, you know, a very British cult focused on most recently in their documentary. This group is not primarily, well, it's not listed as a religion or a religious group that I know of. I know that they have certain Christian influences and parts of scripture that are used. But if you go to your local councillor, your local MP, your local member of parliament, and you sit down with them, because that's their job, to sit down and you know, part of their job is to sit down and listen to constituents' concerns about things happening in the United Kingdom. So you can make an appointment to sit down with your local member of parliament and say, these are the laws around coercive control. My concerns are that groups exist all around us, like the local knitting group around the corner. Somebody has told me that that the woman that leads the group or the man that leads the group is vocally abusive, is stopping people from leaving, is locking the doors, is charging people so much money. All of these things that might concern a person. You can go to your local member of parliament and say, I want to discuss the idea of widening laws around coercive control to include groups. Of course, that's probably not going to do anything, but the more noise that we can make about it as a collective, the more chance there is that people in places that can make these changes will start having these discussions. And I didn't know anything about coercive control or cults before I did this podcast. So if I wouldn't have had these conversations, I wouldn't know what I know now. We can't expect lawmakers and law changers to do what we hope them to do if they don't know either.
Yeah.
So it's really important to just be having these conversations with people. 2 days ago, when I was in Starbucks, I heard somebody giving an MLM pitch next to me, and she was sitting down and she was selling all of these beauty products, and she was talking about to this woman that she was trying to sell this package to, this is what will be expected of you. You'll need to put down this much money, but you'll need to make this much money and sell this many products. And the woman was like, okay, I really need the money. And it was really hard for me not to turn around and say, I'm not sure about this. But after the seller had left, and the woman was finishing up her coffee, I did just say multi-level marketing is really tricky and can be quite dangerous. And that was all I said, because I felt like there was kind of like a moral obligation to say something, but not to be too kind of like pushy.
It's difficult. Yeah.
So I think to just go with Alex Staines' advice of sitting down with people, having conversations, and speaking to your local members of parliament is a great way to start with getting the ball rolling. And South Australia are now introducing laws around coercive control. Parts of America are looking at changing bills to include certain things. At the moment, the way around that is to focus on human trafficking charges. So it's happening and it's exciting, and who knows where we'll be again in 5 years' time.
Absolutely. And I mean, you obviously we're based in the UK, but the same principle applies to democracies around the world. The representatives of the people will only propose new bills, propose changes if they see votes in it, essentially. So the more that we raise these issues and get people concerned about it and actually realize what's actually happening, the more likely it is that politicians will stick their neck out, because it's at the moment it's quite, there's not a lot in it for them, I would say. There's no votes in it, or not, they don't see that there's any votes in it for them, and they also then come under pressure from the religious lobby. It does. So the example you talked about from the BBC documentary, A Very British Cult, was a coaching group, a personal development group, essentially. And it does make you realise that this isn't meant to be, advice about how to do it properly. But if you are going to start a cult, then you better make it religious, because that way you can pretty much operate with impunity. All the employment laws that are in the UK that are designed to protect people with various protected characteristics, for instance, none of those apply to religions. So you can quite happily discriminate against women, against people who are gay. You can discriminate against all of these classes of people if you say it's part of our religion, part of our religious beliefs.
Yeah, it's infuriating.
Yeah, maybe we need to do a petition. How many thousand is it you need before they have to talk about it
in the UK? It's 100,000, isn't it? They have to, if you do a petition, they have to talk about it. I mean, I work with the Family Survival Trust quite a bit on this topic, and if you go to the FST website, there's Alexandra Stein has put together a kind of proposal, if you like, that is the basis on which we want to try to persuade governments to think about changing those laws. The fact in the UK we have laws against coercive control is good. That's a start, but moving it to the next step, which is not just in relationships but also in groups, is obviously hard. But no one thought it could be done for couples or for intimate relationships. So I think it's these things don't happen overnight, but they can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And it changes and progresses every day in the kind of the specifics of that serious crime act. It changes all the time to encompass things like understanding gaslighting, understanding love bombing. This terminology is being brought into the Serious Crimes Act, and people can look at that and they can read descriptions of what these words mean. There's a wider understanding that goes into training social workers, that goes into training teachers, that goes into training police officers. So it is exciting, and things are happening. And once you have definitions and terminology being used in law, it means that when you're trying to prosecute, you can go into a courtroom and you can say, this person loved bombed this person. There's no physical evidence, unless, you have it on film by chance, but there's no physical evidence. There's no marks on a person's body that they were being love bombed, but it's understood in the law of the land that these are things that happen and this is what they look like. So it's allowing for people to be imprisoned because of coercive control. At first, nothing really happened with charging people with crimes of coercive control, but we're seeing it now in the cult news segments that I do daily, weekly, sometimes monthly, whenever I find the time. We're seeing all the time people being prosecuted for coercive control. So the understanding is widening within the public realm. Maybe not specifically with cults, but definitely with intimate partnerships, parents with their children, carers with children, whichever manner it takes place.
Yeah, and my prediction would be that there will never be a law about cults, because the word cult is not definitive enough. It's too woolly. We both use it in our titles for our podcast, but we know that it's not a legal term that is really defined
the tactics
closely
used by.
That's right. So it'd be more like relationships, organization that was doing this or that was structured to do that. So I don't care if there's not a law that says it's about cults. It's really about what these organizations are doing, isn't it? And that's where I think we could start to see some changes, organize systemic areas of abuse where people are manipulated and coerced into doing certain things. And as you say, I mean, the laws around slavery are almost there, really. If I'm an organization looking for labor in a fruit picking company or something, I have to obviously be careful about how I source that labor, and there's all sorts of laws around that. So there are already laws that may be applicable, I think.
Yeah. I was thinking as well, Kacey, do you feel like it helps as well? So obviously there's a lot of people that, as we said, that have been in these groups that have, it's difficult to want to talk about it because of all the fear attached. Because obviously if you talk about it, you lose friends, family. They, in some groups there's collateral, there's blackmail, all of these things. So it's difficult to talk about it. So I think another reason to highlight it's important people that haven't been in these groups to talk about it is that, at least hopefully it helps with not having the same leverages against people that were in the groups. Do you feel like that's something that gives you a benefit, or like means you're able to talk about things?
I think so. It's a kind of a fine line, because it's you can be sympathetic and empathetic to a certain point, but without having the lived experience, you can't fully understand somebody's experiences. And even if you did, you can't really ever completely understand somebody else's experience, because you're not the same person. So if a former Jehovah's Witness was to explain their experiences to you, Stephen, I'm sure even then
Absolutely.
Your experiences would be very different. So there's that to consider. And through reading things and becoming educated, you can offer terminology, and you can offer definitions, and you can talk about certain models and frameworks that experts have developed, where you could say, well, that would fall into Janja Lalich's bounded choice framework, for example. And you can talk to people, about how did that feel? How was that experience? But you can't ever say, oh, I know what you mean. I know how you feel. I know what you're saying. On the flip side of that, I didn't think that I could be traumatized or impacted by people's experiences. So when a person talks about their life in a cult, there's always a discussion I have with people before we hit record about triggers, re-traumatization, and all of these things are really, really important to consider before an interview takes place. So there's always a document that I send out to people to collect some written information about a person's experiences before I speak to them. And that includes questions like, how long have you been out of the group? I think that's a really important question to ask, because sometimes people may tell their stories relatively soon after leaving a group, and that might cause ramifications, Celine, as you mentioned, for them in their personal life. It may impact them at work, because some cults love to get you into trouble wherever they can, in kind of pushback for you speaking out. But it can also re-traumatize a person and leave them feeling like they are having those experiences all over again. And I try to check in with people after we finish recording, and to make sure that a person feels okay before I just end the Zoom call and say goodbye to them. Most people say that they are in therapy, that they are recovering, that they have certain things that they can do to allow them to stay safe. I also highlight to people that if there are questions I ask them that they don't want to answer, that they don't answer those questions. You only talk about what you're comfortable to talking about. And of course, the guest has come to me to ask to tell their story. So I'm not pressured into saying, oh, I really want to hear your story. Can you come and tell me? What I have learned through doing these interviews is that vicarious trauma is a massive thing. And you can find yourself immersed in so many dark experiences, so many really difficult stories, that it does rub off on you. And I found myself feeling really low, really unmotivated. It felt like burnout, but with a kind of like a low level of anxiety, like bubbling just underneath. And it took me so long to put my finger on what it was. And it was speaking with Nicola Ranson, who is a psychotherapist and a cult survivor, that she pointed out to me that I was probably experiencing vicarious trauma. And I just thought, well, that's ridiculous, because I don't have these lived experiences. And she said, you don't need to have these lived experiences. Therapists and counselors often have to speak with other therapists and counselors to keep themselves in check, to make sure that they aren't experiencing this. So when it comes to speaking with people about their experiences, we have to make sure everybody stays safe in those environments. And that includes knowing when to take a break. That includes knowing when a person emails you about their experiences and you don't feel entirely comfortable speaking with that person. And it also means that you can speak frankly to a person about their experiences if you think that it might be too soon for them to share their story. If you don't have this kind of like clarity between yourself and your guest, then you're at risk of harming both of you. I'm not sure, Celine. I think having some type of objectivity helps to listen to people's stories and to ask certain questions. But there is still a risk that a person can be impacted by another person's experiences and stories. So when that objectivity starts to fade, and when your anxiety levels increase, that's when you have to take a step back. Otherwise, you're no good to anybody. You don't want to hear people's stories if they're just harming you. So that's a good way to kind of try and balance things out.
I think you've raised so many interesting points there, Kacey. And I kind of want to just echo some of that. I think not wanting our listeners to play their tiny violins for us as podcasters, because we love doing the podcast, and I'm sure you're the same. It's a real privilege to do it, and it's we meet loads of great people, and it's great fun and so on. But yeah, there are some side effects from doing it, and some of that is just being absorbed in this world can become very very stressful and anxiety producing, I think. And I notice that myself, and there's times when I just don't want to engage at all with any cool content. Yeah, well, I just like, as you said, you know, you just want to watch some silly comedy on television, or you just want to, I'll get out on my bike, or just not engage with it at all. And I tend not to consume lots and lots and lots of cult content. Obviously, I listen to you, Kacey, and one or two others, but I don't consume lots of that content, because it is quite hard work. You know, it feels quite difficult. I think the other thing that is not seen is that you are aware when you're talking to somebody, and like you, we don't really approach people to tell their story. I don't think I've ever contacted anybody to say, would you tell your story, unless they have already written a book, they're writing a book, or maybe they have a podcast. So they're already out there talking about their experience. And then I feel, okay, it might be really interesting to get them on the show. But I wouldn't approach people unless they'd shown an interest in doing that. But still, if people approach us, you still have a feeling that you do need to make sure that you feel comfortable about that person sharing their story and talking about it. But there are limits to what you can do. You know, we are small indie podcasters. We don't have a team of researchers that can go and fact check everything. So in some respects, you are trusting what people tell you, and you have to do that. It's their story, so their interpretation of their story is the one that you're hearing. So I think there's just definitely a health warning on some of that has to be said, and it's, you know, we do the best we can, but you can never be. We're not like the BBC or CNN, you know, where you can send a group of reporters down to do a whole bunch of research on something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the moment, I'm kind of glad not to be like the BBC, because,
well, yes.
you know, well, something that's been really interesting for me to watch with your content, that makes me laugh every time I see another episode, is the reviews that you're doing around movies that have kind of like cult connotations. So the Truman Show concept was really interesting. And the reason I laugh is because I sit down to watch something mindless and there's always a reference to a cult, or there's always something cult-like. So you actually can't ever be unimmersed from this work. The other day, and I don't know if you've done an episode on this yet, but if you haven't, you have to do an episode on this. I watched, I was like, oh, I really want to watch a Danny Boyle film. So I'm going to watch The Beach. And obviously it was like the most cult-like film that I have watched, because they all go off to this island that nobody else knows about. And only one woman is allowed to speak at group meetings, and she dictates what happens on the island. And if you leave, you can't ever come back. And I was like,
it's all there. I've not seen it. Have you seen that, Celine?
No, the only thing I know is they ruined the actual beach, didn't they? I think that's all I know. Yeah, I think they had to pay reparations after the fact. Yeah,
and they closed it down to the public after a while, because it was just becoming so polluted.
Oh, wow.
I think it's just opened again this year.
Film.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, you have to.
Yeah, no, that's good. It is on my list to watch, actually. Somebody was talking about it the other day, because it's Alex Garland wrote the script, didn't he? And I'm a massive fan of his as a movie maker. After that, he started to make movies. He's a brilliant filmmaker, and so yeah, I do want to watch that and maybe read the book. But yeah, okay, there you go. Commissioned us to do that then. We'll do that.
Well, I made notes when I was watching it, so I'll be interested to see what you pick up on with both of your backgrounds and both of your education and awareness in this field that's different to what I picked up on. I think that would be really interesting.
I think that's the nice thing about those episodes. They always feel quite personal, because obviously, you know, everybody reads a film differently, and we're looking at it through a very particular lens. And it's like a busman's holiday in a way. It's kind of, we can just have fun and watch a film and then talk about it, which is it's kind of great. But we do like doing those episodes.
Well, it's an excuse to sit down together and actually have like a movie night, isn't it?
Exactly.
Everybody's so busy just being busy then it gives you a nice, we've got to do research tonight. We've got to watch the Truman Show.
The trouble is, though, is that you watch. So I watched it with Sarah, my wife, when we were on holiday, and obviously you think, oh yes, we need to talk about this, but then you have to watch it again with your notebook and keep pausing it, so it loses some of its appeal.
That's true. That's true.
So we have different approaches. I'm working on vibes, and you're working on a notebook. Yeah,
that's right. You do the vibes bit, and and as we're talking about it, Celine keeps introducing things that I'm gonna ask later because I'm going through it in order. But Celine just likes to keep chucking different things in. But it sort of works.
Because you're chronological and I'm thematic. This is the right? difference in how we are. Yeah, there's a process. I
am definitely chronological as well. So I'd be like, Celine, put that on the back burner. We're not there yet.
That's the final scene. You can't talk about that yet.
No, you get your 4 segments, and then you bunch them up, and then you throw them in. So you're doing the bit about groupthink. You do all those scenes. That's how you do it.
Do you skip straight to the last page of a book?
No. So it's just how I reflect after the fact. I don't reflect chronologically. It's in themes.
Well, anyway, it all works, I think, pretty much. Okay, cool. Well, Kacey, you've got an important thing to do straight after this podcast. So we won't hold you up any longer. But it's been absolutely lovely to talk to you. We do keep in touch every now and again, and it's great to do it. I think it's nice to have a bit of a mini community of cult podcasters to support each other, even if it's just morally supporting each other. We really love the work that you do, really value it. So thank you so much for that. Kacey, thank you very much for coming on Cult Hackers.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Celine. I appreciate both of you, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank
Definitely
you.
will.
You too.